It's more about what you can't say about community than what you can say.
If it is the case that it is true, you can't deny it.
If they have exclusion baked into them, then that's a false university.
Hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast a week of bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And this week we are going to be jumping back into our book club, delving into Sergei Prozorov's Ontology. I always fuck up the title. What is it? Ontology?
Ontology and World Politics.
Void Universalism 1.
Void Universalism 1.
Yeah, okay.
It just
And
rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
it doesn't. None of this book rolls off of your tongue or your mind at all. And we are very aware of that. So it is definitely a dense piece of writing. I mean, the whole book is only, 100? The actual text is like 130 pages or something?
140 something, I think.
Yeah, so it's like 140 pages, which is a very lean text. And it's because there's no fat whatsoever. It is probably the most philosophical international relations text I have ever read.
Yeah, I pity any IR students who are like, oh, this sounds interesting, and trying to comb through some of the stuff,
Right.
the philosophical stuff on it.
So we are very aware that it's going to be very dense. The last couple episodes, we've done 3 episodes on it so far. If you're not caught up, definitely catch up. But nevertheless, even if you haven't caught up, you could still delve into this. We'll give brief little recaps, and then we'll try to be as clear as possible so that you aren't, you don't need to necessarily listen to the other 3, although you can check them out. I think you should. It's a very fascinating book. His project is really interesting, so we will be delving into that. Also, to let you know that our Patreon is alive, and we are starting to add the extra bonus content. The first bonus episode is out. It's on a sort of deep dive into the philosophy of this guy by the name of Byung-Chul Han. At least one text of his that was called The Agony of Eros. And then I answered some questions from Twitter, and that's something that we're going to try to do on a relatively regular basis as well. Troy's busy as fuck right now, so how often are you going to be able to join me in these bonus episodes here? Well, right now he's got some major shit going on with studying for things and preparing for teaching and just moved into a new house.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be there. Probably not as much as Austin will be. So if you like the dulcet tones, then you might have to...
the dull tones?
What would you say?
The what tones?
I wouldn't say you have dull tones, dude.
Okay, no, I don't think so either. If you like Austin's over-enthusiastic performative philosophy, then then you'll love the bonus episodes. But yeah, so we're going to try to do some interviews and various other kind of musings on contemporary culture and things like that. And you can unlock that for $5 a month. And then we're also going to be doing a monthly newsletter that also is included in the $5 a month patron subscription. And then for $2 a month, you get put into the pool of individuals who get to vote on a topic that Troy and I will cover in the main segment. So we'll be opening up that up periodically. We don't know if it'll be monthly or every other month, but we will open it up to polling from patrons that are in the $2 or $5 and $5 tier. Obviously, if you're in the $5 tier, you get involved in that as well. And then the $2 tier, you can be a part of that. And our Facebook page. Did you see that, Troy?
I did not. We have a Facebook page. I try to avoid Facebook. I
know you don't really exist. You are kind of, I mean, technically you're off the grid if you're not active on Facebook. Like that's what off the grid means in 2018, right?
Yeah, I mean, look what happened to James Gunn though, dude.
James Gunn, is that the dude from
who directed Guardians of the Galaxy and stuff?
Oh yeah, I was thinking, who was I was thinking of the other Gunn, the guy that's the fashion designer host. God, I can't remember. What did he host? He used to host some reality show. Never mind, it doesn't matter. People who are listening know who I'm talking about. No, what happened to James Gunn?
He got into like a internet fight with Ben Shapiro, and then a bunch of alt-right kids went and dug up some nasty tweets of his in the past, which were legitimately nasty. And then he got fired from Guardians of the Galaxy and he's lost all his projects, looks like.
Damn. Is this like recent?
Yeah, I think it happened today.
Oh shit! Wow, he got
So that's
fired.
why. Well, first of all, you just shouldn't be a dick and say nasty things, but also just don't go on the internet. Secondly,
I mean, unless you're going to subscribe to our podcast and contribute to our Patreon and follow us on
just do
Twitter.
that at a public library and then leave.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we have a Facebook page now too, because I know a lot of people don't have Twitter, and they've like hit me up on Insta, and I'm never on fucking Insta. So like, just find us on Facebook, Owls at Dawn, and yeah. So I think that's it for announcements. So okay, done with that boring shit. Fuck that admin stuff. It's time to get into the meat of the show. It's time to get down with the first segment where one of us gets to rant and rave about what it is that's pissing us off from the week. It is the Shitty Minute, and this week it's Troy's turn. Troy, what's got you down, brother?
Well, first, I want to just question your little intro there, your prologue. I don't like the idea of mixing the metaphors of meat and shitty. The Shitty Minute being the meat of the show, because then you're talking about shit as being a meat, and that's just gross.
Beat your meat. Wait, what?
This is like the antipasti
The
of the show.
antipasti. Okay.
That's a better metaphor.
Italian food isn't my favorite. Can you?
Because I mean,
can
do
you
you not like
Japanese
having a little
food?
bit of feces in your antipasti?
Yeah, I guess. But can you do a Japanese metaphor? Like sushi's my favorite cuisine. So what would be the appetizer at a sushi restaurant? Edamame?
I don't know, like gyoza.
Okay.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
want shit in any of those either, though.
No.
We probably just
Okay.
shouldn't use metaphors since we already have one that's shitty. That's our metaphor.
Okay.
So it's the shit
what's
you take before you go out and have a big long day. That's what it is.
Perfect. Perfect.
So my shitty minute this week, it's shitty even in that I chose this. It's not only shitty in content and shitty
It's
in
meta shitty?
yeah, it's like meta shitty. It's shitty in multiple ways.
Okay.
Because it's about politics, contemporary politics, and it's stupid. And
Mm.
I don't want to talk about it, but I feel like I didn't have anything else that was shittier than this. So to follow the rules of the podcast, I had to choose it. I just want to make it clear that it is possible that all three of the following statements are true. One,
Okay.
the Trump administration in some way colluded with Russia to influence the election. Two, this is a bad thing that happened. And three, it's also possible that this didn't influence or change the outcome of the election, and Trump would have won regardless. And so, in conclusion, if Democrats rely upon this one story and sort of base their entire the midterm elections and the 2020 election on resolving this specific aspect, then they'll lose again. And you can say that while admitting that it's an important thing, just not the most important thing. It seems like it's hard for people to grasp. All I see is people saying treason, treachery, betrayal, we've lost our country, this kind of, like purity nonsense, which is just really dumb. And the other side, people being like, it's all craziness and Russia's actually a good guy, or we do the same bad things to Russia and its history and to other countries, which of course is true, but totally non sequitur. There's some cases in which, this administration's actually been harsher on Russia than previous administrations. And in some ways, that's probably true. But that doesn't negate the fact that there's this other thing, right? The collusion aspect. So I don't really want to talk about this too much more, but just the idea that you can have like a nuanced take on the news and on current events and admit that multiple things can be true that are in no way mutually exclusive. Everyone should just chill the fuck out a minute and be like, yeah, it doesn't have to fit like popular narratives.
I feel like that's the theme of all of our shitty minutes is chill the fuck out, people.
Yeah, sometimes we have to chill the fuck out too, though.
Yeah, that's true. But that's fine. That's why it's meta, right? Because even by proclaiming that people need to chill the fuck out, it like redoubles back onto us and we need to chill the fuck out.
Sometimes telling people to chill the fuck out makes them chill the fuck in or to not do it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's like when you're in a fight with your partner, if you ever say, hey, just calm down.
Let's just sit down and talk about it.
Yeah, that's not good. That's not good, man. My ex, when I was in Ireland, I remember one of the conversations we had, she actually like wanted the opposite of that. She's like, why don't you just ever fight with me? And I was like, because I'm not a fighter, like I'd rather reason. and talk through this. That wasn't good. She did not like that.
Yeah, I think it matters. It's like if you fucked up and did something wrong, and then you're like, let's just chill out and reason this
Yeah.
out. Then
Uh-uh.
you got to just go through the storm, right? You got to just suffer
Hey,
through the
it's not
storm.
that big of a deal, okay?
It doesn't work.
No,
But
no,
if it's
no, no.
mutual, then people should be able to sit down and reason about it. Now, maybe you can allow someone, a few moments of having an emotional reaction because we're humans. But, if it's a mutual thing and no one's wronged the other, then people should be able to chill the fuck out and actually think for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough too. I don't know, especially with the mainstream media's coverage of Russiagate, as it's being termed. It's so ubiquitous and pervasive that it it seems to inject far more fear and immediacy into the need to respond to this perceived imminent threat from some sort of hostile foreign power, right? It's almost like in some ways the old 1970s, 1980s Red Scare rhetoric has been rekindled, and that somehow Russia is the Soviet Union and it's the communists versus freedom, and the Cold War is looming over us, and we must act on this now. And this is becoming the prime narrative, like you said, that if this is what the quote unquote left, the Dems, uh, who are not the left, but we can get into that another time. But if this is what the Dems' strategy is to focus on this and somehow delegitimate the Trump presidency based on this, based on some sort of boogeyman that is totally anachronistic and that itself is just seems to be in bad faith and seems to be based on resentment, ressentiment in the Nietzschean sense. This idea of you lost and you're bitter about it and you're just grasping at straws for some sort of strategy to bail you out. All it really shows is the real lack of cohesion within the Democratic Party for actually building a positive political program to stimulate and motivate people to get behind their program. I mean, it just shows a real lack of imagination more than anything.
Yeah, lack of imagination, and also it just makes them no longer culpable for losing the election. That's the big thing, right? It's the boogeyman that I can
It's blame
blame.
shifting.
Yeah, it's blame shifting, and it no longer places the sort of the distance created between progressives and Democratic Party and blue dogs, right? The center left
Mm.
Democrats, which obviously had a huge sort of stake in between them after the election. And if the Russia thing is the real reason why Trump won, then that's no longer a primary concern, and you can sort of wave away or dismiss any notion that you need to change the party. The party didn't do anything wrong if that's the case. And those are all just, I mean, we don't want to fall into like attacking the motivations and stuff. And those motivations could all be entirely correct, and yet the Russiagate thing still be entirely true, right? And I don't know how much of it's true, but it's very clear that I had the same evidence everybody else who's a common plebeian has, and some people are jumping on this thing. Like I've seen like prominent people on even the left say that the Putin thing is important because Putin is the head or some sort of huge symptom of global white supremacy, and that if you want to fight racism and the white supremacist movement, then you have to fight Putin. And it's like, the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, this has been a new meme on Twitter that a lot of my friends who I trust their reasoning abilities, like Michael from that does This Week in Hip Hop. If we ever bring that back, I'm sure he'll come on here eventually. But that he used to do This Week in Hip Hop, that he kind of retweeted, or I don't remember if he commented on it, but that people like how do you say his name? The guy that wrote and directed and starred in The Big Sick, Kumail
Kumail Nanjiani.
Nanjiani, yeah, Kumail Nanjiani, that he said something like none of this would be happening if Putin weren't white. And there seems to be this thing, and then of course other people are like, what the fuck does that even mean? Like, I've seen this take, but what does that mean that it wouldn't be happening if he were white? And I think I get that he's trying to say that there's some sort of global habitual tendency for European domination or like a Eurocentric power dynamic. And that makes sense. But then the problem is this: what about fucking Saudi Arabia, man? They're not white, and Trump and the American government has been chummy as fuck with them, giving them all kinds of weapons and doing all kinds of deals for oil forever. I mean, those petrodollars they're flowing.
Yeah, all the South American dictators as well. I mean, it's just clearly trying to make a reason for this Putin thing to be important, which maybe it will end up being. We don't know what all the evidence is yet, but just take the evidence as it stands, and it could be any number of things. It could be Trump's just a huge buffoon, and some like weak dictator, which Putin kind of is overall. Like, it's kind of a backwards nation that economically suffering. They're not, other than their huge military. They're not like an existential threat to the United States or anything. Or it could be that there's a lot more going on there, but we just don't really know yet.
Yeah, and then Trump, of course, is going to deny, not because he has any sort of stake in political purity or anything like that, but simply because if he admits that there was collusion, then that somehow tarnishes his victory in his mind. And so he doesn't want to in any way concede.
It could literally just come down to that he just doesn't want anybody else to get credit for the thing he's been touting as his world historical accomplishment.
That's right. I know. This is it is farcical. It is, if it weren't tragic in the sense that human lives are at stake, you sometimes have to laugh, right? Like, this is that tension. I don't know if you saw Bo Burnham's stand-up Make Happy, but at the very beginning he says, the world is not what does he say? The world is not funny. And then it's like so-and-so millions or billions of people are without clean water. The world is not funny. Guy Fieri owns, a handful of functioning restaurants. So it's like in one hand he giveth seriousness and then take it away, or gives humor and takes it away. And it's true, man. The world is this complex farce in so many ways.
Dude, what if Mueller pulls a Comey and like a week or 5 days before the midterm elections just comes out and says, yeah, there was no actual wrongdoing by Trump or any of his family members, so they're good.
Oh, yeah. Well, then I guess I'll have to vote for Trump. I mean, that's the rules, right?
What will Democrats do if they stake their entire claim in the election on that? That would be pretty hilarious.
Gosh, I know. Fuck, man. I don't know.
Let's still talk about this shit. It's stupid. It's shitty.
Yeah.
Appropriately shitty.
It is meta shitty. Thanks, dude. I appreciate that. You got me down for the start of this episode. Now you're going to have to claw yourself back.
Don't worry, we're going to talk about extremely abstruse philosophical or political philosophy, so you'll enjoy it.
Yay!
All right, so for our main segment, we're talking about Chapter 3 of Sergei Prozorov's Ontology and World Politics, Void Universalism. Chapter 3 is titled The Three Axioms of Politics, and I guess probably we should kind of do a quick little synopsis of Part 1, which was Chapters 1 and 2 of the book, before we jump into Chapter 3. You think that's appropriate?
Cool. I'll let you lead this.
All right, so I'll do Chapter 1 and maybe you'll do Chapter 2.
Okay.
You have your notes in front of you? You have like 3 minutes to get your notes in front of you if you don't.
I don't have my notes. I'm going to have to go through my cabinet in my brain.
All right, so the first chapter, Three Concepts of the World, Prozorov went through the three different conceptions of the capital W world, which world politics would be the subject of world politics. What is the world and world politics? The first conception was the world as everything, and he dismissed that for various, kind of classical philosophical reasons. The idea of there being a set of all sets is incoherent. You can go back and listen to our episode on that if you want some further review of those criticisms. The second was the world as something, and this was the thing that he thinks is sort of in the era of the postmodernism and the discourse as it currently is conceived. This is the dominant picture of the world, and this is where you have particular conceptions that just fight each other because they can never achieve a true universalism, so it denies there is such a thing as a true universalism. And he rejects that as well for not really being a world politics, since it's just a particularistic conception of the world, and says we don't need to fall back to that because we can have the third conception of the world, which is the world as nothing. And that's extremely confusing, but he posits the idea that there could be a void at the center of the world, and that we can actually develop a world politics based upon this conception of the world as nothing, which he'll then extrapolate on in the following chapters. Which brings us to chapter 2, bringing the world, or politics bringing the world into worlds.
Yeah, and so
Got your
in
notes yet?
chapter no, but I'm just gonna bullshit here. So in chapter 2, he basically says, okay, so if this is the case that the world is void, what could a politics possibly mean? What could it possibly be if it's built on this concept of the nothing or the void? And so he wants to then go through these I guess, various political orientations that he thinks are problematic, and then ultimately gets to one that he thinks is more apropos to the concept of the world is void. So he talks about these various. This is where he goes into these various forms of, let's say, political nihilism. And so he talks about what is this 3 forms of nihilism, right?
Right.
So for him, nihilism is best represented in what he calls imperfect nihilism, passive nihilism, active nihilism. And imperfect nihilism maps on to the world as everything, which is this idea that you have a sort of particular regional understanding of politics, and then you inflate it to an absolute universal. So it's what he calls a universalization of the transcendental order of a particular world, which is basically just saying that the various relations that make up any given singular world, let's even just say a nation state, America, that gets universalized into an absolute, universal, eternal understanding of a political program. He calls that an imperfect nihilism because it involves what he calls the violent subsumption of other particular worlds under the false universal. And it's sort of the embrace that smothers, right? And then he talks about passive nihilism, and passive nihilism basically recognizes the idea that the world is void, but it says that it's inconsequential for worldly politics, for existence whatsoever. So it doesn't attempt to fill the void with some sort of positive content like imperfect nihilism does that has to cover over everything. But it just simply says that we shouldn't even worry about searching for the universal because it always is going to be outside of our grasp. So let's just be content with this radical proliferation of individual regional things. So that would map on to the world as something notion that he develops in the first chapter and that Troy just mentioned, that sort of fits into this idea of difference and competing discourses and cultural relativism that is sometimes categorized within the postmodern gambit. And then there's active nihilism. And active nihilism, he says, is Nietzsche or Carl Schmitt's understanding, where it's this idea that there is a nothingness, and that what is required then in face of this absolute inauthenticity of the world, it requires like a strong decisionism that comes from nowhere, but is a sort of arbitrary decision that is made. That's a sort of positive. It's a forcing, if you will, that refuses to think that anything is necessarily rooted in some sort of metaphysical or transcendent truth, but is something that is required based on a strong will or the will of the sovereign or something along those lines. And then how does the chapter end, Troy? I can't remember.
And then I think it ends with him making that distinction between what he wants to do and what Schmitt wants to do, right? Where Schmitt's and Nietzsche's nihilism, active nihilism, is a decisionism, right? It's where you just make a sovereign, arbitrary decision over what's valuable and whatnot. And he wants to distinguish himself from that by saying we don't have to do that because the world actually does have an essence. It's just that essence isn't anything positive, like you'd find in the false universalisms, right? But instead is just a void. It's a nothingness. So in a sense, he's going to say that it is an essence to the world, and we can actually derive some axioms for politics from that void, as strange as that may sound. He thinks that's a better project than Schmitt and Nietzsche, who basically just see the void and then like kind of run away from it. They don't want to tarry with it at all.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to briefly say what he means by his conception of the void. It isn't when we think of something as not being there. We walk into a room and we say, "Is Jennifer here?" No, she's not here. That's like absence or void or privation, right? Or deprivation. It's the taking away of either something that was there or something that's expected to be there. That's not what he means by void. He has a sort of positive notion of what the void means. And for him, it's when all of the identities of a given world or a given context or a given set or a given particular community, those are all worlds for him, right? Those are all sets for him based on the ontology that he borrows from Alain Badiou, or that he applies from Badiou. The void is what is there when all of those identities are stripped away. And it isn't some sort of like, and I think this fits into this chapter because it isn't some sort of Buddhist conception of a monism, right? That really we're all just stardust, or really we're all just part of the one, or really we're all just connected through energy or something like that. It's not some sort of, which I know is not in any way like an orthodox Buddhist understanding, but that's like the LA version of Buddhism. It's not that. It's something a little bit more complex than that, and I think that matters. But it's this point of understanding that our worlds, as we tend to understand them, based on the relations within our given worlds, the relations within our political system. We were just talking about Trump and the Democrats and Russia and Putin. Those are all relations that are contingent upon various worlds that are played out on planet Earth, right? And the world of America and the world of Russia, and then the world of geopolitics, and then the world of Democratic Party politics, and then the world of the media. And then even within those worlds, there are sub-worlds within them. So in the world of Democratic Party politics, there's the world of how the media portrays Democratic Party politics. And then there's the blue dog Democratic Party politics. And then the more Justice Democrats Democratic Party politics. And those are all worlds within these larger worlds. And the way that they all interrelate with one another in our everyday experience takes place at these, what Prozorov refers to as intra-worldly or phenomenological, at the phenomenological level, or at the intra-worldly level. And that those things aren't really the world as void, but rather the world as void is that thing that cuts through, that grounds all of those things. It's the remainder. It's when all of those contingent relations are stripped away. When you strip all of that back, what is it that remains at the level of being, at the level of existence, at the level of what is there? You might be tempted to say the really real, maybe. Some people, I don't know if he would say that. He doesn't say that, but I feel like you could say that. And that's what's really real. That's what's left over. That's the indivisible remainder, we might say, is this puncturing void, which he actually refers to as a multiplicity, which is where it gets maybe a little bit confusing. So when we think void, think of a status of being that is completely devoid of, separate from, not defined by any properties or any relations or anything that we generally tend to think of when we assess the world. It's all of that stuff stripped away. Colors and smells and lights and feeling and tensions that you have with your friends or partners or families or political strategies or petrol dollars or greenbacks or anything like that. Anything that you can think of that exists. When all that is stripped away, what you're left with is the void.
Yeah, he uses the analogy again with mathematics and set theory of extensionality. And in set theory, extensionality is the property of a set where a set composed of, say, elements A, B, and C is exactly equal to a set containing the elements C, B, and A, or the members C, B, and A. So it doesn't matter what their, you use that key term previously, relation is, right? All that matters is what members that they have. And so, for instance, it doesn't even have to be necessarily what we typically call political, right? You can just look at like our physical bodies are made of all sorts of sort of members, and our body is in a sense the set of all those members, right? Now, we privilege and have relations between those members when we talk about ourselves as having an identity. So when I think about myself as being a male or a man, right, I'm privileging certain aspects of the members of the set of my body, principally like chromosomes and gonads and whatever else, right?
Penises.
Deep voice, stuff like that. Penises, so multiple.
Yeah. Whatever. It depends on how manly you are.
Yeah, and so all that the world as void does is it strips, nice metaphor again, strips your penises. Strips your penises from you. It keeps those members, right? Again, members, great metaphors.
You keep saying members, and I keep thinking, yeah. I'm thinking like an Austin Powers joke is popping into my mind.
Who strips a penis, really?
I will call him Gold Member. Or what is that?
Isn't it Mini-Me?
I would call him Mini-Me. No, but what is... Remember the dude's name was Gold Member.
That was that. I never saw that, the Gold Member one. Was that the one Beyonce?
That was the Dutch one. Yeah, that was the one. Yeah.
I don't think I saw that one. Okay, so anyway, you're privileging certain members of the set of my body when calling myself a male, right? All the world as void does is it strips that contingent relation, right? Because there's no sense in which person's chromosomes and gonads have to be the distinguishing property of them from another person. We just privilege that aspect of it. It could be that the size of your ear is what distinguishes if you're a person or not, right? It could be, it's just as arbitrary. So all the void does is it strips those contingent relations between members and keeps the members themselves, right? They're there, they exist, or Prozorov uses the term facticity, right? In their sheer or brute facticity, or their fact that they exist, is the only thing left. And the relations between the members are gone. So you mentioned earlier, is this the really real? I mean, you could interpret this as a realist, in a realist stance, right? And talk about sort of a mereological nihilism, where there are only individual things and there are no true like compositional things other than that are contingently made. But you could also treat it as more like a non-realist stance, like I guess like a Zizek, right? Where you find like the real happens in through the symbolic and there's nothing really underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to get too much into it now, but the problem with the mereological nihilistic reading of this, I think, still plays out at the level of what he would say the phenomenological and not the ontological, right? So mereological nihilism seems to kind of like, it basically argues that there are only simples and that there are no complex bundles of things, right? So a chair is broken down into its simplest parts, and really what exists in a chair is the simple parts. So would eliminative materialism in the Churchlands, would they be mereological nihilists?
I don't know that they are. I don't think you have to be an eliminative materialist, because usually like the Churchlands are that about the mind, right? But I don't know if they're that about all of metaphysical entities. So
okay, but like it breaks things down into their parts and says that the wholes are epiphenomenal. They're not the really real. The really real are the simples that make everything up, and that what's really real are just simples. I don't think he's quite saying that, because that still is taking place at the level of relations. He actually would go, and this is what I want to get into, and I want to use this as a metaphor, kind of moving forward. But I feel like there's a click between the move between the ontological and the phenomenological, and what I mean by that is So what does all this have to do with politics? So his argument is that the reason this is important is because this is stripping everything back and understanding the world as void allows us to get to truly universal principles that help us not just to build political programs moving forward. That's not what he's most interested in, but allows us to understand the grounding of actual political relations today. So when we speak about democracy, when we speak about freedom, when we speak about justice, when we speak about these terms that like relate to political concerns, when we speak about the law, those things are actually already grounded on this concept of the world as void. And it's because the world as void is this universal constant that is true. It is there, whether or not we always recognize it, or whether or not the void is affecting a given intra-worldly political order that much. It doesn't matter. The point is that it's a fact that the world as void is grounding those political things. And that's his primary concern, right? It's not necessarily to build a political program on the world as void or according to the world as void, but first the step is to recognize simply that it is the case, and then to realize the effect that this has on actually existing political orders or actually existing political relations. And then you can sort of understand maybe how to build a political program based on that. But that's the first step, and that's what's important. And the reason that for him is so potent is because it is something that is demonstrably provable, and it sets up an absolute universal grounding that helps us to understand politics now, and then of course moving forward what politics could be. And then of course he needs to derive these axioms then, because he wants to say, okay, great, world is void, but that's just some sort of weird abstract ontological category. What does it mean then in terms of actual specific political axiomatics or logics that will help us to understand politics today? And that's what this chapter is about. It's defining, let's say, these three, what he calls axioms of politics that he derives as effects from the void.
Yeah, it's a super important point, I think, because you could interpret Prozorov as kind of following in like the pre-Kantian metaphysical tradition, like a Spinoza or a Leibniz, which tries to build metaphysics first and then build everything else on top of that, like the geometric sort of kind of format or style of philosophical reasoning.
Or like what the world is just mathematics at base, like.
And then
something
try to
along those lines.
extrapolate everything else from metaphysics in the kind of traditional pre-Kantian sense, right? The dogmatic metaphysics that Kant called it.
Well, and you see that in contemporary science too, right? They try and do stuff like that.
Very
Like,
much so.
The world really is just really mathematics at base, right? Math is the language of the universe, that sort of thing.
And he's very clearly not trying to do that for many different reasons, probably, right? If you asked him, I would be interested to hear. But he's definitely trying to take we can sort of talk about metaphysics, right? And that's going to be very important. It's going to import some important principles to us. But we do need to realize that we're coming at this from a positive world. And so we need to find something from within the positive world that we're currently in, from whence to take this. Because you can't just start with, abstruse metaphysics and then derive everything else about what's true from it. It's not going to work. So yeah, I really appreciate that you make that point, because it can be easy to fall back into this. Let's just start deriving principles from others and come up with an entire a priori set of truths. And it's not just trying to do that, right? We're trying to figure out what is the grounding of already existing political programs, so we can determine which ones are actually infidelity to the axioms which comes from the void, and which ones are actually a betrayal of those.
Right.
And that's a much weaker claim, not weaker in the sense of bad, weak in the sense of not overly strong claim. Whereas if you're trying to derive everything from a simple set of mathematical axioms, you make one mistake and everything falls apart. It's like a Jenga game, right?
Right, exactly. Now, interesting. Okay, so I said this a minute ago. It's this click that I keep. It's the only way I know how to describe it in my own mind, because it kind of jars every so often in his discussion. Whenever he tries to move from the ontological to the ontic, or from the void to the positive worlds, or from the world with a capital W to intra-worldly phenomenological relations, there always seems to be some sort of gap that he thinks that you can smoothly get into, that you can smoothly bridge. And he does a lot of work in this chapter trying to bridge that gap. But for me, there's always a click. There's always a friction. And what I mean is so he, just to lay it out there, the three axioms that he says that he derives from the void are equality, community, and freedom. Not in that order. Community, equality, and freedom are the way that he does that. And I actually think that matters for him. I actually think it matters in the way that he develops them. But the problem is, and this is something just to keep in mind as we now kind of get more into the meat of the chapter, is that those terms, and he addresses this, but it's just not sufficient for me at the moment. Those terms themselves are so overdetermined by positive, phenomenological, intraworldly experience that I don't know how possible it is to get to that speculative level of analyzing and categorizing or deriving categories from the world, or what he calls being in the world with a capital W. Because it seems to me that you're still, as soon as you do that, you're incorporating it into a linguistic framework which is so immersed in the symbolic order or the linguistic order or the phenomenological or the intraworldly order, that I wonder how pure are we ever going to be able to accurately talk about the world as void in this axiomatic framework without corrupting it by these positive worldly ascriptions.
And
Does that make sense?
Jean-Luc Nancy's worry, right? That the political sort of innovation has to happen with the part of no parts, and the second that you try to make an actual consensus political program, you've already like ruined it, right?
Well, no, that's Rancière.
Oh, Rancière, I'm sorry. Yeah, I had Nancy in the brain because we just talked about him in this chapter. Yeah,
because he talks about Nancy in this chapter. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a worry that he addresses, right? And he references the French Revolution as obviously community, equality, freedom. Those are the three terms of the French Revolution, right? And says,
"Can you do your best French accent? What is it? It's liberté, fraternité, égalité."
Yeah, you do a lot better and more nasal filled than I do.
Terrible.
So yeah, those are the three terms of the French Revolution, and obviously those were betrayed almost immediately, right? So they didn't follow through on those.
Yeah, Napoleon came along a couple years later,
and then some shit happened. So and he references that and says, actually, this is a point he thinks in the favor of his argument, because the very fact that we remembered those three terms, and even though we don't speak French, maybe even know them in French, means they have some hold on us, even well and above and in excess of the historical contingencies in which they were sort of utilized and developed. Because most people today don't really know much about the French Revolution other than it happened and then it kind of was undone very quickly, right? And there's a lot of violence in between. The sort of intricacies of how that was developed and then who was faithful and who was not and how it fell apart, that's all kind of contingent and isn't super important, but those three terms still have meaning. Well, why do they still have meaning? And he thinks it's because they trace back to this ultimate grounding of axioms. Now, whether or not that's convincing is a different story, but he's sort of positing not necessarily evidence there, but an illustration of his point.
Right, and he says that he uses this term, it's called a future anterior. It's it will have been the case that. And so future anterior is future and then before, but it will have been the case that this was always the ground. So his point is that in some sort of analytical discovery, even if the French Revolution was the first time these terms, community, equality, and freedom, were ever used, the point is they didn't invent them out of nothingness. It wasn't some form of nihilism, as he criticizes in the previous chapter, but rather that those things serve as a future anterior. They, in the context of the late 18th century, realized a truth that already was the case, or that always already had been the case. And so that's the same with our understanding of political analysis now, as we look at geopolitical strategies right now, and we can recognize, he believes, through a rigorous sort of ontological analysis, that it will have always been the case when we do discover community, equality, and freedom as underpinning these phenomenological intraworldly orders. It will have always been the case that the void was actually the ground of the effects that we see played out in that particular world. So it will have always been the case that the void was there determining or grounding things.
Yeah, I mean, as an analogy, people make analogies between mathematics and these sort of normative concepts all the time, right? The number 0 as an actual like integer, right, wasn't really discovered or created, depending on what you think about mathematics, until like I think Indian mathematicians in like the 4th century.
Okay.
And so before then there was no integer concept of 0, right, as on like the number line. So I'm pretty sure that today we would all say, well, even if the ancient Greek and Roman mathematicians and people before that who were using mathematical concepts, even if they didn't know there was a 0 or conceive of it, in some sense it still did exist if you're like a mathematical realist, right? Which I think most people are, except for a couple of cranky metaphysicians in America. And so as a kind of analogy there, this is kind of what he would say about the community, equality, freedom as the void of the world in politics. Even if we don't necessarily currently have it discovered, it still has a sort of effect and it still exists in some sense. And it certainly, when we discover it, it will have always existed. It's not a thing we create in our discovery.
Right. Okay. So community, equality, and freedom. This is what he says are the axioms that we can derive from the void. Let's start with, which sounds nice, right? That community, equality, and freedom. Those are three things that I think people who are interested in communal or transformative political orientations can get on board with. Fuck, every American loves to talk about freedom, so and equality, right?
But he dashes that hope though. He dashes that hope pretty immediately, right? Everything we like about community, equality, and freedom, he just dashes and says, "Nah, you can't do that."
Okay, so let's start with community, yeah?
Yeah, so community, he has it's sort of like elementary or atomic propositions for each of these things. So for community, he says community is not there is a community to which all belong, which is usually how we think of community, right? Ultimate political community is had by all of the brotherhood. Notice brotherhood of
which
mankind.
Is a point that yeah. Well, and he it's a point that he comes back to with this idea, because community is oftentimes understood in terms of fraternity, and so that's something
Right.
that he wants to address. Like, why not sorority? Why isn't it sisterhood? Or why isn't it some sort of gender neutral term? So that's something he will address.
And even then, if you were to have a community of all humankind and make it nice and gender neutral, you would still have this whole set of things. And he wants to say that's not what community ultimately is, because we're deriving community from the void, from the nothing. There is no thing that everything has in common. That's part of sort of subtracting ourselves from the positive order of the world. So there can't be some common substance that every individual human has that makes them a community. That just can't be the case. You do that, you're falling back into the false universalism. Instead, the only commonality that they have is that they don't have a commonality. So lacking a commonality is the commonality. So he says the phrase is, there is not a community to which X does not belong. So the only thing you can say about community there is that it doesn't have exclusion. It's like I wrote this in my notes, it's like a negative theology of politics. And he'll do this furthermore on the next two axioms as well. It's more about what you can't say about community than what you can say. If someone has a community and it involves any sort of exclusionary principle as part of it, then it's not a community based upon what's true about the world. It's based on a false universalism at that point. Only when you have some sort of exclusion in the community. So there isn't some clear positive commonality between all people or even all things. There is just the not exclusion.
So this is where I get a little confused. And it is if we're going to argue that, what is the point in maintaining this notion of singularities, which he talks about? Because singularity seems to imply phenomenological relations or transcendental indexing. So if we're going to strip all of that back and go to the void, how can we even speak of community? Because that seems to imply, at least in our understanding of things, a necessary differential relation between identities or between singularities. But if there are no identities, why even maintain this notion of singularity? What allows us to justify the existence of singularities as relating to the non-existence in their non-relation or in relation to the non-all? Like, it seems that we should just go full monist here and be like, there is nothing. We are all just part of the singular one. How can he justify the non-relational relation that he is establishing to ground community?
Yeah, I had the same question. Isn't difference a relation? Of course it is, right? And so you have these different individual singular multiplicities that are out there, right? That's some sort of like hierarchical structure to being, right? Even if you strip away all the positive identities, like being a man or being a Christian or being a human being or whatever else, right? And you strip all those away, then apparently you still have some sort of base hierarchical structure to being. That's why, I mean, for me, it's like there's some sort of metaphysical doctrine here that's implicit that maybe we have to get at, but that certainly seems to be a kind of a standing thing, right? But even if you wanted to go down the monist route and say everything is one, there is no actual difference, to base to base community on that, I think Prozra would say it would still be a mistake, right? Then he would think that's only because you're basing it on a positive transcendental.
Right. Well, and so this is one of the things he says is he keeps using this word it's homonymy and homonymy. I mean, I don't even know how you would say it,
Homonymy,
homonymy, but it's basically a homonym, which for people listening, remember that a homonym are two words that sound similar or the same but have a different definition. So bear and bear, as in B-A-R-E and B-E-A-R, right? There, and there is the one that everyone fucks up on all the time online that people yell at each other about, right? Those are homonyms. They sound the same, but they have different meanings. And that's one of the things he talks about here. We say the word community all the time in our social and daily lives and political discourses. We say the word community, equality, and freedom all the time, but there's a homonym, a homonymy or homonymy that we need to understand, that what he's talking about as being the universal absolutes of community, equality, and freedom are different than the sort of way that we tend to speak about them, and that there's a homonymal relation
Homonymal?
or whatever. Homonym. It's a homonymal relation between them. So so here's what's interesting. So this idea of multiplicity or of community at the ontological level existing does kind of fit well into his reading of Badiou, who wants to argue that at the level of the void there's just pure multiplicity. And it also seems to fit within this sort of Deleuze ontology. I mean, I'm obviously interested in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, because Deleuze wants to talk about this idea of infinite difference or unbounded difference and singularities and things like that exist, bodies and machinic assemblages later on in his writing. So I think that there's a tension here, and I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile it in my own mind, but I think at the very least we can understand that he's standing in a tradition that is being debated in political philosophical circles, with trying to say that there is this ontological, that there's this way of speaking about ontological difference that isn't reducible to the homonym of the way that we speak of difference in our daily lives, which is based on like these differential relations in our phenomenological experience, or our everyday experience, right? I keep using this metaphor because when I'm recording, there's a fan in my room and I look at the fan, but I'm looking at this fan right now. There's a differential relation between me and the fan, right? I'm an identity, the fan is an identity, and we are different based on the fact that we have different identities in our relation to one another. Same with my cabinet and my walls and the curtain and the bed and my phone. There are differential relations between all of these things. That's different in its homonymal relation than what he's developing as the community grounding, or the grounding of community at the level of ontology.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, though. Wouldn't the Deleuzian sort of program be sort of an antagonistic towards this? Because for Deleuze, aren't the assemblages irreducible, ultimately? Or maybe infinitely reducible, but just not reducible to like a single point? Whereas I think at least implicitly, Prozrov's stating that there is a singularity that this can be reduced to. And he's calling that the void, right? But it's sort of, you don't go any further than that.
Yeah, but see, this is where I get confused. Then why maintain this notion of singularities that exist in community at the void, or that can even be discussed about? Because if you just have this void as being a single singularity, then there is no such thing as community. It's just void. That's where I'm having trouble understanding this. I feel like he's retrojecting phenomenological understanding of community onto the void as much as he claims that he's trying not to.
Well, I mean, he is saying that the community aspect, there's all these singularities, and they don't have any commonality between them. They don't.
But how can you even have singularities? That's the point. Like,
Well, yeah,
how can you have...
Yeah, I'm saying he's just sort of, that's a condition of possibility for this program. So he's kind of just stating it.
Yeah.
But then if that's going to be a condition of possibility for the program, then you can't have the Deleuzian reading, I would think, because Deleuze wouldn't accept that there are these singularities, whose only commonality is that they don't have a commonality.
Yeah, I don't know. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, we might want to come back to that after we finish the book and see if we have any more clarity on that question. But I'm going to guess probably not.
Okay.
So,
okay.
For further exposition's sake, commonality or community is the first axiom. The next two are equality and freedom, and they're pretty much the same logical sort of action is happening for those. Equality is not the typical one we hear, which is everyone is equal because they have some feature X, like because they have reason or human dignity, or because they can experience happiness or experience suffering, and that makes them morally important or something like that. Instead, it's there is no being X which is not equal to being Y. So again, we have this in the negative, the double negative actually, right? There is no being X which is not equal to being Y. So anytime you see a sense of equality where someone is excluded or something is excluded, that's not real equality. That's not the equality based in the void. And the same thing happens with freedom, right? Every being is free from every other is the sort of negative program which he's rejecting, which we hear a lot, like the negative liberty that Isaiah Berlin talks about, right? Instead, he posits there is no being Y from which X is not free. Again, double negative. To say if you see a conception of freedom where it's not actually, there's exclusion there and someone is not actually free, something is not contingent, then that's a lie. It's not based in the void because everything is contingent. And that gives us, he thinks, both a negative freedom, right? We're free from any contingent positive world which is placed upon us, any contingent identity which is placed upon us, and a positive sense of freedom because we can then become any identity.
Right.
So yeah, those are the three axioms and the double negative sense in which they are developed from the void. The main point, I think, being, he says this, the opposites of those three are exclusion, hierarchy, and domination. And really, I think they're kind of reducible to exclusion in the sense that if you see any sense of community or equality or freedom and they have exclusion baked into them, then that's a false universal. And you can know that immediately.
Could you reduce the axioms then to community?
Maybe you could. He says that, didn't he say you can't do that? I can't remember exactly.
Well, so he talks about how like people like Balabar and Nancy will kind of bridge together community and equality, right? And that they come up with these various like neologisms where they're bringing them together because community and equality are kind of the same thing. And then that even freedom and equality necessitate one another, right? That true freedom is freedom in community, freedom in common, right? And so I feel like there is a sense in which they sort of meld together, but they still retain some sort of nuanced individual property or notion.
Yeah, I mean, probably reducible wouldn't be the right term, but certainly you can't have one without the other, too. Right? So if you reject one, you reject all three.
Exactly.
And if you accept one, you accept all three.
Yes.
Because they follow from the same logical principles.
Of the void.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So what the fuck does this have to do with politics?
Yeah, this is the important point, right? Because in defining the axioms this way, he basically undercuts the easy transition, right? Because the easy transition would be, look, the void says community, equality, and freedom, so let's all have community, equality, and freedom, right? And then he's like, no, you can't do that. The fact that we don't know the meaning of these terms, other than the fact that they are, he thinks is actually kind of the point. And he makes this distinction between justice and the three axioms by making this point. There are many different concepts of justice, right? There's the liberal concept and like the Rawlsian concept and the communitarian concept and a revolutionary concept of justice. And there's like the Platonic concept of justice and the like Nozick libertarian concept of justice and whatever else, right? The reason there are all these things is because he says justice isn't one of the axioms. Justice is sort of like a fidelity you have to the axioms or a lack thereof to the axioms. And so you could sort of be infidelity towards the libertarian notion of justice, and that libertarian notion of justice could not actually be based on community, equality, and freedom. So he wants to sort of separate these three axioms from your typical political programs or usages of those terms, and say that these things are sort of, it's good that they're bare and they lack any obvious political significance because they're just facts about existence, period.
Yeah, I think justice is a form of management of identities at the phenomenological level, right? Justice is a form of ordering or managing, or it's a form of controlling, in a way, the transcendental coordinates of the relations that we tend to understand. So, in a very banal sense, the relations between myself and my curtain and my fan. Justice is a form of sort of uniting us, and how does that actually make sense politically? Is that there is some notion of property rights, right? Like, the fan is mine. So if someone came in here right now and just walked into my room and stole my fan, I would have right to be upset, because that's a violation of the just relation that I have over the property rights that I have with my fan and my curtain in my room right now.
We talked about this very thing, just to kind of give an example again. We talked about the libertarian notion of property rights regarding the guy who got thrown off the, was it the United Airlines flight?
United? Yeah, United flight, yeah.
Yeah, right. So like the true libertarian position would be that was absolutely fine. Like he signed a contract which says that if they overbooked the flight, then he has to leave. And then everyone else sees
Right.
that and is like, that's bullshit. Like you can't drag a guy off a plane for that he bought tickets for. That's ridiculous. So those are both different concepts of justice, right? So there's no way to distinguish between them without going back to the ultimate principles upon which they're based.
Would he be saying, in a way, he's kind of making an argument then in this sense that libertarianism is essentially nihilistic because it's not based on the axioms. It's a sort of decisionistic imposition or an imperfect nihilism that it establishes itself. It legitimizes itself as a universal, but really it's not, because it's based on these contingent notions of property rights.
Yeah, I actually really like this point. I thought the same thing. And I think he didn't say this, but maybe this is too strong for what he's claiming. But I got the sense that he might say that there's only two ultimate forms of justice: nihilistic and like non-nihilistic, or the kind he's promoting, right? So like,
Right.
there's the kind that actually follows through on the axioms of community, equality, and freedom, right?
Which is communism, interestingly enough.
Which is what?
Which is some sort of communist invariant he talks about with regards to Badiou, which I think
Well,
he'll talk
he
about
says
later.
his is weaker than that. He says it includes that, but it's in
Okay.
excess of that. So he's going to
Okay,
include other
okay,
things
okay.
as well.
So it's not communism like we think of, Leninism and the realization of Marx's notion of the means of production and the democratic means of production and shit like that, dissolution of the state and all of that other stuff. It's not that.
Yeah, it might include some forms of that, but it's going to include much more than that, I think he'll get to.
Okay.
But then if you don't follow through on those axioms, which any form of justice that has exclusion in its community, or hierarchy in its equality, or domination in its sense of freedom, any that has those things is nihilistic in a sense. So everything from like a libertarian notion to a classical liberal notion to a maybe like Marxist, like really, historical materialist notion, kind of all end up nihilist in different degrees, right? Because you can betray those axioms to different degrees. But they all kind of fall
Right.
under that umbrella. And actually, as much as that may be oversimplifying and making too strong of a claim, I kind of liked how neat that is.
Yeah, in a way, these axioms serve as hammers that deconstruct every popular political philosophy, right? Like someone comes along and it's like, here's a notion of justice, or here's a notion of society, here's a notion of community, here's a notion of sovereignty. And it's kind of like, well, hold on a second. Here are the axioms. What are the relations between this program that you're prescribing and these axioms? And the axioms sort of always, because they are actually there and they are producing effects, they might just be bastardized by the positive intra-worldly political order, but they're always there. And then at the same time, they're always disrupting and challenging and contesting any given political program.
Yeah, I actually love that, because I think it's kind of what we do anyway. We just don't really have a grounding for when we do it. It's how critique works, right? You look at libertarianism and you say, well, the problem with this is that it's entirely founded on the notion of property rights, which is totally arbitrary, right? And so even this notion of freedom is based upon property rights rather than property rights being based on freedom, right? And so you expose that and say, well, this is not a true concept of freedom then at that point. No, what is a true concept of freedom? I have no fucking idea. Right? But I know it's not
We
that.
don't know, but it's not that.
It's definitely not that. And the classical liberal notion just as well.
Right, and it's necessarily not that. It can't be that.
Right, exactly.
It cannot be that. So anything that you are prescribing, Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, that cannot be the absolute that you are claiming that it is, because it is essentially a bastardization of the understanding of the universality of existence as such, which is the void.
Yeah,
so it cannot be that.
It's a classical modus tollens argument, right? If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. If libertarianism is true, that means freedom is based upon property rights or is entailed by property rights. It's not the case that freedom is entailed by property rights. We've just shown that, right, via the axiom of freedom. So therefore, libertarianism can't be true, right? It's a classical logical argument, and it really is kind of easy. Like, it's not that difficult to formulate the criticism in that way.
Is it a simple deductive argument that he's ultimately establishing here? So if it is the case that like you set it up that the world is void, and then once you have that, you have this conclusion that all the premises are sort of subsumed under, right? That any premise then is sort of subsumed under.
Yeah, I'm not sure if his argument is deductive so much as he's providing the tools to make really easy deductive arguments against positive political programs.
That makes sense. So where do we go from here then? What else? I mean, I feel like we're kind of wrapping this up, this section up. So how can we bring this home a little bit more even?
Well, I think the last thing we should talk about is the non-anthropocentrism stuff, right?
Okay, yeah.
So, I mean, you probably noticed we've been saying something or things instead of humans or persons a lot, or maybe correcting ourselves when we say some person and say something instead. That's because obviously these axioms, community, equality, and freedom, they apply to all beings, all existence, not just humans. And so at the end of this chapter, Prozorov says, yeah, that's absolutely true. These apply to everything that exists, not just humans. The only difference between humans and tables and rocks and chairs is a positively inscribed identity, which we've just said we've subtracted ourselves from to get to the void. So this does apply to everything. And it kind of reminds me a bit. Have you read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation?
No, I have not.
So the book's kind of the classical text on using like a utilitarian calculus to argue for at least certain animals having moral status, right? Because they can suffer. It's primarily the reason that Singer offers. Like, they can suffer, and if you can suffer, that means you have a moral status that the suffering should not occur, and so we have a moral duty to not cause suffering to animals. And uses like utilitarian arguments to do that, right? And it's kind of as much as Prozorov wouldn't be into the utilitarian calculus part of it, right? It's kind of a similar argument, I feel like, because Singer makes the point that in that book that any argument you have for why animals shouldn't be included in the moral calculus that humans are included in, that same argument can be applied to some humans. So if you say, well, animals can't reason, then they shouldn't be included in the moral calculus. Well, some humans can't reason also. Should they be no longer have moral status? Some animals don't have the capacity for like the high pleasures of like intelligence and human love and stuff like that, right? So they shouldn't be included. Well, some humans can't either, like children. Right? So that kind of same structure of that argument is kind of what I think Prozorov's making. And he's saying you can't make a distinction between humans and non-humans, and humans being like docile and only ones who can really engage in these high political concepts. You can't do that without inscribing some positive notion of what it means to be human, which is contingent, ultimately.
Right. And then he's not going to some sort of like Janist argument that you need to walk around with the broom and make sure that you're brushing bugs away in front of you so you don't accidentally step on them, and wear a mask over your face so you don't actually inhale a gnat.
You do that though, don't you, Austin?
I mean, I try to not move from my bed as much as possible. And I try not to even orgasm because I don't want to kill those little sperm that are living inside my balls.
Dude, think of all the skin cells that you kill when you do MMA.
I don't anymore because of that exact reason. And I'm in my 30s now. My hair's starting to fall out, so I try to wear a hairnet just so that it stays, so that at least my hairs have a habitat that is nice and warm still. But yeah, I mean, he's not advocating that, right? He's not advocating that, well, all life is connected, therefore we can't do that. He basically, and this might be frustrating to some people, but he says, we don't really even know what the fuck this
Yeah.
implies.
I kind of like that you said that.
You do, yeah. Well, he kind of steals something from Nancy, right? Nancy's like, look, do we realize that we need to reconceive of freedom? Yeah. Do we know what that means? Not really.
Not yet, at
We
least.
don't. But if it is the case that it is true, we can't deny it. And that's what's so interesting about this argument. I mean, so many people in the era of post-modernity are so skeptical of these universalist claims, but he is bold about it. He's saying it is a fact that this is the case. We may not know the implications of that, and we need to be careful with that so we don't fall into the traps that led to the criticisms of post-modernity, that led to us criticizing, the atrocities of the 20th century, the great modern narratives of progress that led to 2 world wars and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people at the hands of brutal dictators and things like that were claiming to wield these meta-narrative ideals that would lead to liberation or that would lead to freedom or that would lead to progress or something along those lines. He's saying, yeah, those criticisms are valid, but nevertheless, there still are universal truths, and we must remain in fidelity to them. We must assert them and recognize that they are the case, even if we don't necessarily know what the implications from that are yet.
Yeah, and he says we can definitely act on them. We can act on them without really knowing the full meaning. In the same way, he makes some like really kind of banal analogies and saying we can drive our car even if we don't know really how it works. We can
Right.
do and we can engage in political programs, even if we're not fully sure about the all the implications of these axioms. And I appreciate that because it's sort of admitting that we don't know everything. We don't know exactly how this is going to be, and we can't pretend that in 100 years the sort of moral economy of the world is going to be the same as it is now. It's probably not, but there's going to be some connection between now and then, right? Like, I can't stand it when people say you can't judge the past based on our current morality. And it's like, well, fuck yeah, we can. Like, of course we can in some sense. Like, we probably shouldn't judge like etiquette based upon a current conception, right? But certainly if like people held slaves, there were people who didn't want that to happen. The slaves didn't want to be enslaved, right? It wasn't like they just didn't realize the slaves didn't want this or something, or like they didn't realize other human beings had needs and it's sort of our duty to like not take away those needs while still admitting that we have a large degree of ignorance on these matters at the same time.
Yeah, no, I'm okay with it too. I mean, here's the thing though, we're philosophers, right? And so he says that that people who are philosophers, this isn't just some sort of theoretical exercise, but this actually fits for political activists and people who are interested in political engagement as well. And so if we can real quick, how do we understand, one, the already existing effects that these axioms have over existing political orders, and two, what impact does that have on actual political programs for us in real material terms? And why is it the case that if it is true that the world as void is constantly affecting intraworldly political orders, why don't we have political systems that better emulate these 3 axioms?
That sounds like chapter 4, man.
Oh, shit. Dun dun, stay tuned. Yeah, I think so. But
those are all the good questions, the exact questions you have to ask, right? The natural questions that arise from this.
Okay. Right. Now, okay, real quick, one more thing that I think is important to understand, and he spends a lot of time talking about Heidegger and this idea of the ontological moods at the very outset, and I think this is important to understand because, again, here we are engaging in this abstract, theoretical discussion over a podcast. How is it that because he argues that everybody is accessible to these axioms of the void. And I think that's important to kind of understand that this isn't just some sort of, for him, some abstract, highfalutin sort of program, but that rather everyone is able to attune themselves to these axioms. And he talks about through like the ontological moods of boredom. Is there a way to break this down that is relatively digestible.
Yeah, I guess we could talk about really quick Heidegger's notion. Right? Heidegger believes that moods are sort of like the way in which Dasein or us are subjectively oriented towards the world that we inhabit. And some of these moods are special because they kind of remove us from the world a bit or subtract us a bit from the world. And so the most famous one is anxiety for Heidegger, or Angst in German.
Angst. Yeah.
And so this anxiety, Heidegger actually thinks this anxiety is what we are underneath everything else, but I don't think we have to go down to that level.
Mhm.
He thinks that we experience this anxiety quite regularly, right? And it's really horrible. Like it's terrible because it's where the world around us loses all of its significance. Everything
Mm.
that's out in the world no longer is ready to hand. It's Heidegger's term for it, where it's like usable and we can sort of just involve ourselves in it. And everything's lost and we just have nothing that's significant or meaningful anymore. And that's usually really transitory and we get out of it. Although maybe if you're like, depression might be a case of not being able to get out of that. But Heidegger's point is, as terrible as that is, it actually clues you into a thing. Because it clues you into how when you're just involving yourself in the world, you're living inauthentically. And to actually, in some sense, like capture that anxiety can allow you to act authentically, or in his conception, being towards death. Now, Prosper doesn't want to go down that whole road, I don't think. He's more using it as an analogy, as far as I can tell, and saying, in the same way that Heidegger wants to talk about us subtracting ourselves or being subtracted from the positive world and it losing its significance, we have those experiences. And when those things lose their significance, it's sort of like the contingency of the positive world showing itself to us. It's actually like taking off its clothes and like showing its nakedness to us, that it was contingent all along. And that's an important point because, as terrible as that might be to experience phenomenologically, it's telling you a truth about the world, that it's ultimately void.
Yeah, that all of these identities are slipping from us. It's also what Jean-Paul Sartre writes about in his novel Nausea. There's a bit where, the main character is like sitting down by this tree and all of a sudden everything starts to like meld into one and all the identities and the relations of things start to slip and slide together and he feels himself like being plunged into this kind of like loose sliminess. And Sartre talks about this at the end of Being in Nothingness, where he's famously writes about something called the slimy, and he talks about like the viscosity of existence, that everything sort of slips and slides together and you feel yourself getting lost into this as the facade of the identities all sort of start to slip away. And actually there was a dude that hit me up on Twitter. His name is Luis Arriaga, and he says, big fan of your shows. Quick question. Have you ever felt that you break the fourth wall while interacting with other people, as if you could like tell the real intentions out of it? And he says, is there a name for this? And I said, well, do you mean that somehow you get a glimpse, quote unquote, behind the veil, like the curtains get pulled back and you kind of get that feeling that everything is just bullshit? And he said, that is exactly what I mean. And sometimes it does not feel like premeditated bullshit, but more like unconscious mechanisms that push us to be or act in a certain way. And I think exactly what he's asking and describing is what this ontological mood is, that allows us to understand the world as void. That there's that moment where you're talking with someone and you're like, oh my God, this is all fake. This is a facade. You're just saying something that you heard somebody else say, and you're only saying it because you feel like you need to say it. Or, you're only engaging in this because the current social structure or educational order or your familial expectations are being imposed upon you, but you don't really have to. And I get this feeling sometimes when I'm driving, like on the freeway, when you're in this and you're all alone and there are these 5 lanes and they're all demarcated. And then you're like, wait a second, I don't need to be in these lanes. I can just drift over, And you're like, whoa, radical freedom, right? It's like these demarcations aren't necessary. And those are those moments when you're tasting a little bit of the void.
Yeah, an important point to make here is sometimes like online troll culture will use this sort of reasoning and say, everyone in all the liberals are just like monoculture people, are just like virtue signaling, right? They're just following along with a program that's sort of grabbed them by the nostrils and is controlling them like a puppet. And I, the virtuous troll, am exposing that fact, right? That's totally missing the point, right? Because the point that Prozorov is making with this, and Heidegger kind of was too, in a sense, at least the critical point, is that everything is this way. Even your intense need to critique somebody else as just a follower or a sheep. Like, that's also what sheep do. Right? So the point is that this is a universal sort of property of existence. This is just how all positive worlds are. It's not making any sort of normative claim yet.
So, you know who Friedrich Hayek was, right?
Yeah.
People who don't know, he's an Austrian economist, and I'm sorry, not Friedrich Hayek. Ludwig von Mises is actually the one I'm thinking of. Von Mises is known as being like this radical anarcho-capitalist. Sometimes, the American libertarians will quote him. They love themselves some Mises. But Mises is famously known for being like staunchly opposed to socialism, right? Any sort of government involvement whatsoever, he would label as socialism. And so there's this famous anecdote, and we don't know how true it is, but it's this wonderful sort of myth that there was this gathering of all of these libertarian or neoliberal economists and political philosophers and whatnot that were at this society, or at this group that's called the Mont Pelerin Society. And they were strategizing for what they would do to overcome the sort of domination of Keynesian political theory, or what they called socialism, in the Western liberal democratic nation states. And this is in like the middle of the 20th century, before neoliberalism really took hold. And famously, Mises runs in to all of these other conservative libertarians and says, "You're all socialists. You're all socialists," because they just weren't radical enough for his anarcho-capitalist understanding, where the only thing that should govern social lives are markets. That's it. No large-scale hierarchical domination in his mind was valid. I feel like Prozorov is allowing us to be like, "You're all nihilists. All of you. Every single one of you. You're all nihilists."
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get that too. That was actually a reason why I don't like a particular kind of philosophical theologian, David Bentley Hart. Remember his I don't remember the name of his like big text. I read it in grad school.
The Beauty of the Infinite.
That was the one, yeah. And he kind of makes the argument that Christianity is the only non-nihilism and everything else is nihilism. It's basically Christianity, Orthodox, capital O Orthodox Christianity, or Nietzsche. Everything else is just false or incoherent. Yeah. And it was I really didn't like that argument, and it was kind of, I think, reductionistic. But maybe this is just like my own personal like proclivities showing itself, but I kind of feel like this is a better version of that, and much more like humble in terms of its own claims about what's true.
Interesting. Yeah. And when we'll see, I mean, so the question is, to just totally wrap things up, we may not exactly know what the implications are of the universality of these axioms of community, equality, and freedom. But for Prozorov, they are the truth. They are, in fact, the condition of existence as such. They are the grounds by which existence exists, or they are just simply existence. Existence exists as community, equality, and freedom. And we may not know what that means in terms of implications, but all of our political systems, all of our structural systems are grounded upon those. All of those political systems are being disrupted by those axioms, and figuring out how then to build political programs moving forward based upon that grounding is a worthy task, because it's based in the truth, with a capital T, let's say.
Right, and you can critique any other notion of justice if it has any sense of exclusion, hierarchy, or domination, because it's not then based upon what's true. If it claims it is, it's false.
You're nihilists. You're all nihilists.
Alright, so for our next segment, we're doing the sticky leaves. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing us meaning in a meaningless world. So, Austin, since we don't know what community, equality, and freedom really actually mean yet, so we have no true meaning.
Bathe in our nihilism?
Yeah, what's got you going before we figure this stuff out?
Dude, I'm really excited about my sticky leaves this week. It's going to be a short one, and I'm going to have to play a little sample clip for people. But I sent this to you last night, my time, today, this morning, your time, and it's this video of a dude on Twitter who is going through all the characters in Mario Kart and giving them a political affiliation.
This was fantastic.
So I'm just going to play this now, and I just want you to enjoy.
It's just your average, like, working class guy, like, oh, get the government off my back kind of guy. Luigi, I think, is a Republican, maybe like a nerdy, like, technocratic, like he cares about the debt to GDP ratio or whatever. Princess Peach, monarchist. Daisy, I think, is an environmentalist. Rosalina is a flat earther. Tanuki Mario, I think, would only care about, like, kink shaming. Cat Peach is alt-right, but one of those female alt-right YouTube personalities that are really popular. Yoshi, I think, is a Marxist. We should be able to agree on that. Toad, radical centrist. Koopa, conservative. I think Shy Guy would be a foreign policy kind of person and like really anti-interventionist. Lakitu, I don't think takes a side, but really enjoys poring over the data and like reads 538. Toadette, definitely Black Bloc Antifa, straight up. We don't know much about Toadette, but you can tell she's got that kind of streak in her. King Boo would be a Diogenes-style cynic. All the babies are hyper-nationalists. They're in their first stage of moral development. We know Wario's a libertarian. Waluigi, male feminist. DK is a tanky. Bowser's a fash, obviously. I think the Dry Bones, they would be like Alex Jones conspiracy theory people. They always talk about chemtrails. Bowser Jr. would be a single-issue voter for the Second Amendment. Dry Bowser, I think, is just kind of a nihilist. This is just a whole row of turtles, really unnecessary. I don't know what Nintendo was thinking there, but Wendy does look like she would be a passionate pro-life evangelical. And then I think the metal ones would be kind of like third-way Silicon Valley people who think the algorithms are going to get us to Mars. This is all canon.
Yeah, so which one of these is your favorite one?
I like... Oh god, what one is my favorite? Who's the technocratic?
Oh, I think it was Luigi. Luigi is a technocrat.
Luigi.
You know, probably cares about the debt to GDP ratio or something.
That's it. That's funny.
I love the fact that Donkey Kong's a tanky. That's pretty
tanky.
Perfect. He basically acts like he is in the games, so that works.
Yeah, Princess is a monarchist, obviously.
That was too easy.
I know, but God, they are so funny. I like it when he's like, what is it? The young versions. They're just nationalists because they're kind of just emerging in their moral consciousness.
Development. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh Jesus, it's so good. But I love it. It made me laugh so hard. I mean, the internet. We bemoan the internet and Twitter and the inability of there being nuance and the heightening of negative affect and things like that quite often. But at the same time, it also does connect us to some pretty fucking... I have laughed probably more because of being connected to people that I would have never met or seeing videos of animals doing crazy shit that I would have never seen because of fucking Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. So sometimes there is light in the midst of darkness, and this just made me laugh an awful lot. So, and I want to give a mad shout out to the guy's name too that's doing this.
It's like Art House PTX.
Art House PTX, and the name is Art House Politics. So check the video out. It's fucking hilarious because you can listen to it and it's funny, but when you actually see it, it just adds an extra layer of joy, I thought. So I really liked that video. So I had to send it to a couple of people. It's so hard because I don't want to be over dramatic and be like, this is my favorite thing that I've seen on the internet. But it really was my favorite thing that I've seen on the internet in a long time.
Yeah, Waluigi's a male feminist was pretty great too.
Yeah, that's right. A male feminist.
But you know, actually, I'm gonna ruin this now by making it serious. Actually, there's a connection between this, I think, and Prozorov's point we're talking about earlier in the main segment. Since the only thing we can know for sure is that community, equality, and freedom are true, right, as axioms, we don't know for sure what that means for positive political programs. That's an open question, right? That's why we can joke about like kind of important political discussions like this stuff, right? Because it's kind of contingent, it's kind of up in the air, and we're kind of ignorant. And so we can joke about it. Like it's not the most serious thing in the world, right? It kind of speaks to the level of ignorance we have about what like a true justice would be, which is important, right? Because the second you're not willing to joke about that stuff means you think you have a firm grasp on what true justice is, and everyone else is wrong, and you can never learn. And that's like a recipe for like authoritarianism and stuff, right?
Right, exactly. And that is when you do become some sort of nihilist, either the active nihilism or the imperfect nihilism that he criticizes. So, yeah. I'm finding this book thing to be really fruitful. I hope that you guys out there listening do as well. Again, I know it's super dense and it might seem crazy abstract, but I think that working through this it's been really fruitful and challenging for me. And God, I'm curious to see how this wraps up in the next chapter.
Absolutely, ditto. It's been great to talk about this stuff, and I have so many more thoughts now after talking about it with you.
Cool. Okay, so thank you guys again for tuning in to another episode here. Feel free to hit us up with any questions. Definitely, if you have any questions about the text, if you have any thoughts, if you have any, you want to talk about what you think Mario political orientations are, hit us up on Twitter, owls_at_dawn. Check out our Facebook page. Make sure to like that. We're also going to be, I've been blogging a little bit more. Troy's been engaging with some of the comments on the blogs, and I'm sure at some point when he loosens up, he'll be able to put some writing up there. and we're going to be putting those up, dispersing them on all of our various platforms. If you want access to the bonus content, make sure you subscribe over at Patreon. It's patreon.com/owlsatdawn. That's how you can get access to the bonus episodes and the newsletter, as well as being able to offer up suggestions for future topics. And then email us at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. What else?
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, real quick. What are their political ideological affiliations? Michelangelo is very clearly
Brocialist.
Brocialist.
Yeah. He's a brocialist.
No doubt. Donatello is very clearly a technocratic liberal.
Yeah, he's a nerd. Leonardo is the pragmatist, and
I feel like Leonardo is a never Trumper who writes for the New York Times.
Okay, and then Raphael is the moody existentialist.
Yeah, I dig that.
Okay, I always loved Raphael. I don't know why. You would think I liked Michelangelo.
You think it's the moody existentialism?
I know, but this was before I was into moody. Like when I was a kid, I was into Raphael. I think it was because I wanted to have size, and I just thought size were the coolest weapon.
Yeah, it was just a vestige of your future. It was a future anterior for you, dude.
It was a future. God damn it, Prozorov. I can't get away from him. I'm not a nihilist.
We're all nihilists, bro.
Yeah, we're all nihilists. Also, go to iTunes. If you could give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review, that'll really help with the analytics and shit like that as well.
Yes, please.
Nihilist motherfuckers. Anything else we got to say to wrap things up, brother?
You know.
What up?
Das Vidania, Amerikansky.